I began my career in education as a fourth grade teacher. And I remember asking myself over and over again, am I ready for this? But I'll tell you, I've had many jobs and responsibilities in education since then, but very few felt as important and impactful as my role as a classroom teacher. That's why I'm so excited and humbled that our final keynote speaker is a classroom teacher. Kyle Schwartz is entering her 10th year in education as a second grade teacher at Doull Elementary School in Denver, Colorado. And throughout her career, Schwartz asked her students the same simple question: what do you wish your teacher knew? And answers to that question came in from all over the world. And in her first book, I Wish My Teacher Knew, How One Question Can Change Everything for Our Kids, and it focuses on realities that students face and how educators can respond to their students' needs by building relationships. Her second book, I Wish for Change, Unleashing the Power of Kids to Make a Difference, is a guide for educators, families, and mentors to help young people find a personal sense of power and use it to better their communities. And so during a time in the history of our field when the need for excellent teachers is more critical than ever, I am so proud that you're about to hear from one of our finest. Please join me in welcoming Kyle Schwartz.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be with you today. I spent some time last night and got to watch the keynotes from the other days and some of the other sessions, and I just have been so inspired, and I am just thrilled to be among you today. So I do want to show you and start with a picture of my classroom from last year, also known as a corner of my basement. Here in Denver, we were virtual, we were remote, eventually we were both at the same time. But on normal days, this is my home away from home. This is Doull Elementary in Southwest Denver, Colorado, which makes me want to give a shout out to the Rocky host committee for setting up so much stuff with Denver this year. So this is Doull Elementary, and I was coming home from Doull one night when I found a crumpled orange sheet of paper in my kitchen. And when I unfolded it, I realized it was a note a student had written to me and I had saved. The note said, "I wish my teacher knew I don't have pencils at home to do my homework." Now, that note was written to me in response to a lesson I had been doing in my classroom for years, but I had never told anyone about. But when I saw it again, I saw something worth sharing. So I typed up a quick little post on my new Twitter account just to encourage other teachers to ask the same beautifully simple question: what do you wish your teacher knew? And much to my surprise, teachers began sharing, and they began using this message and trying it out in their classroom and sharing their experiences. And kids were saying things like, "I wish my teacher knew that I love school. I wish my teacher knew that none of my friends from my last school are like the people I go to school with now. I wish my teacher knew that my family and I live in a shelter. And I wish my teacher knew that I'm trying my best." And as this was all circulating around, turns out a journalist saw all these teachers talking about it, wrote up an article, and all of a sudden, I'm getting a call in my classroom phone from my principal telling me that there are a bunch of news trucks in our school parking lot and asking me if I have anything to share with her. So that led to the next couple crazy days of my life, where my classroom was turned into this platform for my students to really share what they cared about, what was important to them. And people listened. It has spread so far. I've seen notes like this from every country you can imagine. That one in pen is from Algeria, and those little notes tied there, that's from Japan. I got a little a Google alert one day from a small regional newspaper in Iran, and it told the story of this man, this teacher, Ramin Riji, who had done the lesson with his students, found out they were hungry, and because of that started a program where each kid gets a piece of bread and a glass of milk before school. One night I got probably the weirdest call of my life. It was from an unlisted number, and when I answered it, it was the Vice Admiral of the United States Coast Guard, which I'm sure my fellow Coloradans can identify with, was a little strange because we don't really have coasts to guard. But he told me he had heard about these teachers doing it, tried it himself. He tried it with all of his troops, and he said it was one of the best leadership exercises he's ever done. And I still remember this. He said, "Young lady, leadership is listening." And pretty soon, students started doing what they always do. They took over. And kids really used this "I wish my teacher knew" format as their own advocacy. There was a group of kids with dyslexia who started sharing what they wish their teachers knew about them. The National Down Syndrome Society worked with kids for them to share what they wish their teachers knew about their experience in school. That little boy, he's holding a sign that says, "I wish my teacher knew I can do more than just hug." A group of college students in Canada started a campaign to share with their professors what they wish they knew about their experience as an Indigenous First Nations student in school. This one here says, "I faced racism in school, drug, alcohol abuse, sexual, physical abuse, but I'm gonna be a teacher." I got another message once that kind of just left me in chills. It was from a middle school student, and she said pretty plainly that she'd been planning to kill herself. But her teacher did this "I wish my teacher knew" activity in class, and because of that, she was able to ask for and get help. And it really has made me realize how important it is for us to be humble enough to ask and wise enough to listen to those voices of our students, the kids who are experts in their own learning and know themselves the best. So that's what we're going to get to. We're going to jump into it today. We're going to go through 3 big topics: how to build relationships, how to create a sense of belonging, and how to respond to kids' needs. And how can we help teachers do that? So first of all, from seeing all these notes from all around the world, I've realized that kids really crave connection. They say things like, "I wish my teacher knew they were my parents away from school. I wish my teacher knew I don't have a friend to play with me. I wish my teacher knew how much she impacted me and how much she still does." And just as a note, these notes I'll share with you today have been submitted from kids of all ages, all over the country, to share with you and share in my book. And it makes me think of one of my favorite quotes in education that I just keep coming back to again and again, that no significant learning happens without a significant relationship. And if we think of our own life, we know how true that is, right? Whether it's learning to read, learning to write, to speak Spanish, ride a bike, all of that happens in the context of a relationship. But we know more about the brain that makes this even more true. Well, I hope some of you got to go to Zaretta Hammond's awesome session here. But her book is probably one of the most highlighted books I own. So run, don't walk to go get it. But what she describes is that the brain is just so amazing. It's evolved to keep us safe. And it has this reticular activating system that is constantly scanning for threats. And when it sees a threat, your amygdala fires, it sends in these hormones, and you hyper focus on that threat. But the problem with that is our brain is a social organ. So it has evolved the same way to respond to a physical threat, like being attacked, as a social threat, like feeling isolated, feeling unwelcome, feeling ashamed. Your brain responds the same way. That amygdala fires, hormones shoot through your brain, and for about 20 minutes, your brain cannot process that new information and do that hard work of learning. But luckily, the brain is also a social organ, right? So it is also evolved when that reticular activating system senses safety, when it senses relationships and comfort. It also sends awesome hormones out like dopamine and serotonin, where you are able to connect with others. You are able to cooperate more, to trust more, and to do that work of learning. And I love this quote from her book. Positive social relationships signal to the brain a sense of physical and psychological safety so that learning is possible. So maybe you're with me and you're like, okay, Kyle, I get it. But how do we teach teachers how to form these relationships, right? Well, I got you. This is one of my favorite thought leaders here, Carl Rogers. He was prolific, way ahead of his time, founder of the humanistic approach, student-centered learning. And through all of his writing and all of his research, he identified 3 core conditions that must be present for significant relationships to form, for the type of relationships that lead to that significant learning. The first one is congruence. By this, he means genuineness. So the self that you're presenting and the self you actually are congruent. He means to be authentic, which I want to highlight here because there's something we forget a lot in education, that if we want to know our students, we must also be willing to be known. If we want to know their hopes, dreams, and challenges, guess what? We have to share our own too. And that leads me to something that has completely just changed and transformed, like our theme here today, my instruction this year. Another great book, super highlighted in my library, The Vulnerable Heart of Literacy from Elizabeth Dutroux. She really advocates for the pedagogy of critical witness and testimony. And she says that vulnerability can be the pathway that connects to connection that allows the hardest parts of life to reside in our classrooms. So based on her amazing writing, I made a small change to my lessons. I've been teaching kids to write friendly letters for years, but this year I showed some vulnerability, and my model was a letter to my grandfather who died before I was born and I have always wondered about. And by showing that vulnerability, kids were invited, certainly not required, but invited to do the same. And I was blown away by how they took up the charge. I mean, every single kid really chose someone that was deeply meaningful to them. And we were working on similes, and they were able to craft these beautiful similes like, your kindness is like a metal wall. Or I miss you so much, I cried like the roaring ocean. When they told me you wouldn't make it, my heart sank to my toes. And one girl decided to end her letter to her grandma who had recently passed away. She said, I hope this was a good talk. I'll see you next time I write. Made me think, man, we are just scratching the surface of the power of literacy and the power of relationships and vulnerabilities in our schools. So that brings us to our second core condition, empathetic understanding. I love how he puts this. He says, it's the ability to understand each student's reaction from the inside. And kids are begging us to do this, to understand them from the inside. They say things like, I wish my teacher knew that moving schools, it's hard to make friends with people you feel don't like you. I wish my teacher knew sometimes my reading log isn't signed because my mom is not around a lot. I wish my teacher knew it's difficult to pay attention, not knowing where you're going to sleep at night. And I wish my teacher knew that I've lived a hard life. I tried my hardest and best to remain positive every second of the day. The question here is, can we make space for this reality? And the way I like to think of it is, instead of rushing to judgment or even rushing to a solution, I think what we want to do is just rush to curiosity. to find out what is happening in that kid's life, to find that reaction from the inside. And one thing I use that really helps me, I call it the danger of one word. And we've all had this experience if you've ever been in school, right? There's a kid who's refusing to do work. And sometimes we can call that with just one word: lazy, oppositional, irresponsible, or probably the one I hear most in schools is disrespectful. But when I hear myself explaining a whole situation with just one word, I know I've lost that empathetic understanding, because there's always so much context, right? Maybe that kid's refusing to do work because they're not the smart one in the family anyway, or they're so lost they don't even know where to start, or they're just hungry and tired, or maybe, right, there's a whole pandemic going on and their priorities are different than my worksheet, right? But what I hope you can see is when we get away from those single words, when we add that context, these are problems that have solutions. We can start solving these for kids. You can't start solving one word. There ain't no solution to disrespectful, right? So we need to make sure that we're keeping that empathetic understanding for kids. Which leads us to my last core condition here from Carl Rogers, probably my favorite: unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard. Again, he just blows me away the way he puts it. He says, it's an atmosphere which simply demonstrates I care. Not I care about you when you behave thus and so. And if we think about our own life, I bet all of us have someone in our lives who loves us, cares about us, supports us, as long as we do what they want us to do, as long as we meet their expectations. And think about those relationships. My bet is that those are the type of relationships that are very limiting. So we've got to find a way to keep that unconditional positive regard for every single student, and probably also for every single teacher you support as well. I think we can look to kids for leadership on this. You know, I had a kid in my class one year, maybe you've had a similar kid, who's just thoroughly and utterly convinced he's stupid, right? Anytime we do anything, Miss, I can't do it, I'm stupid. Miss, I can't even do this, I'm stupid. And oh my gosh, I take that so seriously. And you challenge it every single time. Well, it turns out we were doing one of those lessons, and it was that magical 5 minutes of the day where everyone's working and everyone's doing what they're supposed to do. You know, that magical 5 minutes where none of you guys observe us? Yes, that does happen. Well, we're finally working, and this kid comes up to me and he's like, Miss, I need a piece of tape. And because I'm such a perfect teacher, I said, no, dude, you need to sit down. He said, no, Miss, I need a piece of tape. And he uncurled his hand, and he had the tiniest scrap of paper in his hand. And it turns out he had said for the millionth time, I'm stupid. And the kid next to him passed him this note that said, you're smart. And he wanted to tape it to his desk for the rest of the year. And that's what unconditional positive regard is. You can say you're stupid a million times, and the millionth and first time, I'm still going to tell you you're smart. So that's our core conditions: congruence, that genuineness, empathetic understanding, and unconditional positive regard. So I think the better question is not how do we teach teachers to form these relationships, but how do we make sure that the conditions are even right for relationships to form? How do we ensure that each of these pieces are in place for each of our kids? And one quick little strategy that I'd love to share with you is called last on the list. It was shared with me my first year of teaching by a veteran teacher, and I was, telling her how I was struggling, what was happening in my classroom. She said, Kyle, pull out a piece of paper. I said, okay. She said, get a pencil. All right. She said, write down the names of every student in your class, every single one. And whoever is last on your list, or whose ever name just slipped your mind, that's the kid you need to be the most intentional with. And it made me think that, there are kids, we all know them, they ask for that support, they ask for help, they ask for connection in very loud ways. But we also have kids in our class in every room that have already learned it's safer if I stay under the radar. Don't want anything, don't need anything, don't ask for anything, and I can get through this day. And those are the kids we need to be most intentional with. So I would invite you to share this strategy with the teachers you support, but also I am curious what would happen if you did it with your department or the people that you are coaching. Who is last on your list? Who needs that intention from you? And that brings us to our next topic, which is to create a sense of belonging in our schools. So kids crave belonging. They say things like, I wish my teacher knew that people can, or I wish people could stop bullying other people because then they don't make them feel welcome. They make them feel lonely. I wish my teachers would notice all the kids who are alone, who get bullied, the kids who just want a friend. Ah, man, look at those little thought bubbles just really got me. Like, that's really what's on our kids' minds so much of the time. Well, it really got me thinking about what we need to know about belonging. And especially for my second book, which really focuses on student voice, empowerment, um, and activism, I realized from all the research that the foundation for all of that is actually belonging. That you can't get to those awesome things like student engagement and student voice unless kids feel like they belong. So I read all the research I can find and I reached out to one of the world's leading experts on belonging there on the screen there, Mark Leary. And I asked him, well, from all your work, what do schools need to know about belonging? And he said this. He said, research shows the primary predictor of whether kids like school is the degree to which they feel accepted. Whether kids like school is just going to matter if they feel accepted. Not our awesome extracurriculars, not our rigor, not our data-driven instruction. If they're even going to like our school, they need to feel like they belong there. Then he said this to me, which kind of knocked me back. He said, until their social needs are met, they can't devote themselves to less psychologically pressing concerns such as schoolwork. That just got me because I mean, I've never heard anyone refer to like academics and lessons as less psychologically pressing. But that is what it is for our students. They are looking for that belonging first, and then they can engage in the work. I also learned this, which really changed my instruction, transform, just like our theme, that belonging is not something I can give to kids. As much as I want what, I can't create it and give it to them because belonging is an exchange. You cannot belong to a community to which you do not contribute. Let me say that again, put that in the notes, right? You cannot belong to a community to which you do not contribute. So it really made me think about how we get kids to actually authentically contribute to our schools. Like our school is really good at like co-creating the space with kids. So we have their artwork up everywhere. But that also means at the beginning of the year, like our walls are empty because they're going to create the space with us. I even have kids tell me like, where would you like furniture this year? Where would you want to sit? We create that space. It's this physical representation of their sense of ownership and their contribution. Another little shift I've made is to change that old paradigm of see me after class. You know that old saying, it's like, see me after class, you're acting up, I'm going to talk to you, we're going to straighten this out. Well, I have really changed that in my head to help me after class. And by that, I mean that the first time I'm having an issue with a kid, there's something tricky happening, my first response, my first intervention is to get them to help me in some way. Is to get them to contribute in some way, big or small, to help me pick out the book for tomorrow's lesson, to, oh man, can you please just help me stack the chairs? You don't have to, but it would help me so much. And give them that love and affirmation. I literally did this yesterday. Yes, my first lesson of the day. There's a little girl, she was sitting on the rug. She like, everyone had gone back to the table, but she was just sitting there. And my first response was I actually took a purple Mr. Sketch marker and I like rolled it on the floor to her. And I just said like, oh my gosh, can you please bring me that purple marker? And she did right away. She's like, oh, she gave it to me. And oh, think of that difference in that response. That difference from like, get over here and give me your seat, to even that like nice, like, all my friends have gone to the table, to that switch to like, oh my gosh, you have helped me so much. You always help me when I need it. And I can really count on you. Like, think of the difference of that paradigm shift day after day after day for kids to create that sense of belonging, which I would say has been a little tricky, especially if you guys have been remote teaching or that's a part of what's happening right now. But we talk about collaborative rule setting. And these are screenshots of how I did it back when we were on Zoom all day. I had kids draw a picture of the classroom that they would most like to be in, like what they wanted most from school. And from that, we were able to draw out and tease out some of the rules, some of the agreements that they really wanted in their classroom. And it came from the kids. It started there. So I know a lot of us, we have them too. We have these handbooks with all the rules. We've got the tab on the website that tells kids exactly what they have to do. But I would challenge us to see what kids say. I mean, oftentimes they're very aligned with what we would want as well. But also sometimes they're a little creative. They have different things to say. And if it comes from kids, then they have more ownership and they're more connected to it. Another way is to start with belonging, and shout out to the elementary school teachers, because I think we're all pretty good at it. We all start a lesson or our day with some sort of like community hello or some sort of meeting. I usually use this little kind of format from morning meeting. So we just start with a hello, we have a little share, and then there's some sort of activity. I wanted to point out though that all these cute little things that us elementary school teachers do all the time, like Simon Says and patty cake, like all of that, it seems really simple, but it has such a deep root in science. When you are organizing your body with someone else's body, you are activating your polyvagal nervous system. You're connecting to another person. You get that sense of calm, that sense of connection that allows you to do that hard work of learning, to focus, to feel safe. And it's a little hard because sometimes people think all these Simon Said stuff are just cute little kid stuff, but really to value that and to know how important that is, and to find ways for even older kids to do it as well, to get that polyvagal system activated in their classroom as well. Another thing I'd love to talk about, because this has been one of the favorite things I've done in my classroom, is shared values. So I had kids every year. I have them like they start with a list of a bunch of values, and then they narrow them down, and they vote, and they talk about it, they debate, and they come to their like top 3 values. They vote on it every year. And so one year the kids chose these ones. They chose loyalty, community, and friendship, which really surprised me because honestly, those would not have been the ones that I would have chosen. But that was kind of the point. That is what this group of students really felt in their heart. And that's what I could elevate that year. I think you can also notice that all of these values that they chose and were so connected with, loyalty, community, friendship, those are so collective. Those are so outward facing, how they relate to others, how the group responds. And so that really informed my instruction that year. How could I get this group of kids to use that value of community together? And it led to some really interesting discussions like, all right, well, what does loyalty look like in math class? If you have your friends back in math, what does that actually look like? And so it helps articulate for kids that thing that's already intrinsic for them. And it was so great to see like kids just really connect to this. This kid came to school and he said, Miss, look, I got this shirt because it says loyalty. And then I saw on one of the Valentine's boxes, this girl had decorated her little Valentine's box with loyalty, community, friendship. You know, it just was this like evidence that they really were a part of this and they felt such a sense of connection and ownership over it. I will say that this can often lead to some profound learning. So there was one year we were really focused on empathy, and we talked about understanding how other people feel. We talked about understanding how characters feel in books and why they do the things they do. And that's something we talked about like almost every day. So we read this gorgeous book, A Long Walk to Water. It's a true story of a man who goes back to South Sudan to build water wells for his community. And they wanted to raise money for that charity. So they raised like way more money than I ever thought. They raised like 300 bucks. And the deal was that for every dollar they raised, they were going to take one lap around the track, kind of collectively. And so we're doing this, we're walking around the track, tallying it up. And I see this girl, it's kind of near the end, she kind of sits down in the middle of the track. And because I'm such a perfect teacher, I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Oh, miss, I'm taking off my shoes and socks." And I said, "I can see that. Why?" And she said, "Oh, miss, in the book, the character Naya, when she has to walk to water, she doesn't have shoes yet. And so I wanted to feel what she felt because that's empathy." And I think you can see in that picture, the other kids saw her doing this and they did the same. So we had like 90 third graders walking around our track with no shoes on. And our track is like not paved, it's not nice. It's like jagged gravel. So they were like hobbling around the track just to feel for like a millisecond what it would be like to be someone else, what it would be like what life would be like in the tiniest way for someone that they even wanted to help. And that is some profound learning that can happen. Well, that brings us to our last topic for today, responding to kids' needs. Because when you do the first two, when you build relationships and you create a community of belonging, kids will talk to you about their life. And oftentimes they will tell you about some of the hardest parts of their life, the parts that are challenging. You're going to have to respond to that. So kids are really hoping that we notice this because they want us to know that their lives are just as complex as ours. They say things like, "I wish my teacher knew my mom might get diagnosed with cancer this week. And I've been without a home 3 different times this year alone. I wish my teacher knew my dad died this year and I feel more alone and disconnected than ever. I wish my teacher knew not to pressure kids when they don't know what's going on at home." And I really thought in Jell's keynote yesterday, he really talked about how we can amplify that, how teachers during this pandemic have really taken on the role of connecting with kids' home lives more. And I really think that this is something I would definitely want to amplify in my own teaching in my own school. How can I understand what's going on in kids' lives? Because we really need to imagine these kids in our classrooms, right? Like their worlds are full of problems that are much more complicated than my math worksheet. And I would say maybe for some of us here, that kid was you. Maybe there were times in your life where your world overshadowed the day's lessons. And I would bet that that's why you're such a dedicated teacher, dedicated educator. So, how do we find out what's going on with kids? How do we find out what's going on in their life? Well, one strategy I use that you can use K to 12 and even to adults, and I know because I actually stole this from our staff meetings back when we had staff meetings, is called CQC, and it stands for Celebration, Question, and Concern. So I just invite kids every day to share a celebration, a question, or concern. And kids will take it up if they feel they need to. Like they'll tell you about their new puppy and their sleepover. But I also had one day when a kid raised her hand and she said, "I have a question. I want to know if cancer will kill you because my grandma has cancer and I want to know if she's going to die." And right there, man, I had to stop everything. We talked about it. I was, as direct and clear as I could be. I even said, well, we can talk to your mom about what's happening with your grandma and find out more. And she said, "I did talk to my mom. She told me to ask my teacher." And to think of that kid in class having this burning question every day, to think of that family who doesn't even know how to answer it, that they're hoping a teacher will help them out, that is so important. And it's been such a stalwart in my teaching. I would invite you guys all to try it as well. Maybe model it in your staff meetings, model it with the teachers you support, because that's how I took it on in my classroom. But I want to show you because this has been so important in my classroom that when we got sent to remote learning very abruptly, I put it a little Google form on my lesson page, and it gave kids a chance to say their daily CQC. And here's just a little snapshot of what kids' lives were like, what was in their heads. It says, my celebration is Friday's Easter. My question is, will I ever get to see you? Will I ever get to see you? Will I ever get to see you? Will we ever get to talk? I miss you, Miss Schwartz. I miss you. I don't like this. When is this going to end? No question. Did I miss show and tell? I'm happy to be remote learning. And seeing those responses every day, to see where my kids were at every day gave me such direction on where I needed to go in my content, where I needed to spend more time, what questions I needed to answer for them, and how I could just be honest with what's happening, what I know and what I don't know. I have a list for you here. Um, these are all cited in my book, I Wish My Teacher Knew. 1 out of 20 children aged 15 or younger will suffer the loss of one or both of their parents. 1 out of 20 kids in America have a parent who's incarcerated. 1.5 million students experience divorce every year, and 5% of kids experience abuse, and that's confirmed cases. Experts, and we all know that that number is much, much higher. I also want to point out that even the CDC is recognizing the issue of this. They're finding that reports of abuse and neglect are going down because teachers are the #1 reporters. And for a lot of these last couple of years, we haven't had eyes on our kids. But they're finding that the cases of abuse are much more severe than they ever have been before. And that's really something heavy to talk about, but it's something we need to acknowledge that's happening in our schools that your teachers are contending with every single day, that they're seeing and having to decide how to respond every single day. And I'll tell you personally, that is a weight. That is a weight to carry. I have another list for you. This says difficulty focusing, failing or declining grades, incomplete work, increased absences, noisy outbursts, and disruptive behavior. Now, what is that a list of? Those are a list of all the things that like would get you sent to the office, right? Get you kicked off the football team. But that is actually a list of documented signs of grief and loss from the National Center for Grieving Children. And I have a more extensive one and thorough one in my book as well. I want to point to another sign of grief and loss: overachievement and trying to be perfect. I think a lot of us kind of overlook that one because we tend to celebrate that with kids. Like, oh, wow, you've been so resilient. You are just going after this. You're doing so much better than I ever thought you would. But ultimately, that force, that drive, that if I'm just good enough, it won't happen again. If I'm just good enough, I can change it. That's going to be very destructive in kids' life. So we need to notice that so that we can also respond to those kids as well. Now, hear me when I say, not every kid with failing or declining grades is grieving, but the truth is some are, and we might not even know who they are. I have recognized a lot of this in my students, and being able to see and kind of have eyes out for this and understand when kids are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma is really crucial to responding to them. I had this girl, she was picking up dandelions and flicking them. And I said, oh, what are you doing? She said, oh, my aunt's in the hospital, so I'm wishing she's okay. And so, I picked up my dandelions and started flicking them, wishing for her mom too, or her aunt too. And that little boy there, it was actually his friend that came up and told me, he said, Miss, we did something really cool. We found some special rocks and we buried them and we put an X over them so we can find him again. And it turns out that that little boy, his mom was pregnant. She had his new baby brother, but she had him very prematurely. And because of everything, because of COVID, he couldn't see his mother for months. He couldn't see his new baby brother. And it was just weighing on him. So, what they had done is that they were planning to find these special rocks again when his baby brother came home. And they were going to show him to his baby brother. And that is just something that you just might go past our radar, but that's just a sign that this kid needs support, that they're being so intuitive and smart about creating this ritual that's going to find them comfort, but also something that we can pay attention to as well. That makes me think of how we can really support kids and understanding promises that we can keep and promises we can't keep. You know, it can be really compelling to tell a kid and comfort a kid with, don't worry, this will never happen again, like I'll fix that. But that's not a promise we can keep. So talking directly to our teachers, maybe even having them practice this and having them come up with these phrases that really are trust builders, that we are promises we can keep, like, you know, I will always care about you. I can tell this is really hard. Or this is not your fault and you have people who are going to support you. Those are promises you can keep. And really think about how we can help teachers say that to kids in the time of need. Well, that brings me to this point here is, what resources do kids have? Because often when we talk about grief, loss, and trauma, it can get easy to focus on that because it's so urgent. But even kids in that situation, they want us to know what resources they have. They say things like, I wish my teacher knew I want to go to college. I wish my teacher knew I want to learn more about history. I wish my teacher knew I love my family. And I wish my teacher knew I'm smarter than she thinks I am. When we're talking about that, another strategy you can use and teach your teachers to use as well is to just come up with a simple resource and barrier chart. Like, whenever we're talking about barriers that kids face, also talk about their resources. They go hand in hand. It made me think of Giles' presentation when he said, like, what do you want to amplify? What do you want to hospice? What do you want to create? It's the same idea here. It fits together really nicely. To really think about what resources we can leverage as a school while we're paying attention to barriers that we want to remove for kids. So that brings us to the end of our topics for today, creating those relationships and that community of belonging and responding to kids' needs. I also wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about the I Wish My Teacher Knew lesson, if it's something you wanted to try in your schools or if you wanted to help your teachers learn how to do. There's some things I've learned over the years that are really helpful. So first, if you are going to ask kids what they wish their teacher knew and have them do this, it's really helpful to set a purpose. To be clear with kids that, like, the reason we're doing all this is because we care about your life. We care about you outside of school, and teachers need to know this stuff in order to support you, in order to teach you in our best way. So set that purpose for kids. The second one is to be an example, to go back to that vulnerability. Maybe share what you wish your teachers would have known. Share what you wish your students known. Maybe now in the chat, you could type in a little bit about what you wish your kids knew, what you wish your teachers that you support knew, and think about yourself as an example. Also, it's important to make options clear for kids. This, for me, is expressly an optional activity. Kids can and have participate in many ways. They can choose to write a note to me. They could choose not to. They can make it silly. They can make it serious. They can sign their name to it, or they could leave it anonymous. I also talk to kids about the plausibility of anonymity in a classroom, and in age-appropriate ways, I do talk about how, as a mandatory reporter, I will respond to their needs the way I need to, and I explain that in age-appropriate ways. But also, the fourth one really surprises people. It surprised me as well. It's to share out. because I started doing this and kids started asking, when can I share this? When can I read this to the class? And that I just went with it, Sometimes you just gotta follow kids' flow. So we invited kids, we all sat in a circle, and we invite kids to share their notes. And it has been so moving. They have been able to be vulnerable to share things that they're struggling with. And even when kids don't choose to share, which is completely valid, they don't choose to share publicly, they hear other kids in their classroom, they can empathize with them or maybe even identify with them. I had one girl one year, she came up to me and she was like, Miss, like, I did not know other people had divorced parents. Like, I thought it was just me. And because another student shared that with the class, she was able to realize, like, oh, like this is something that other people know. This is something that doesn't make me just weird and different. It's something other people can identify with. And then the last one is to close with community, to really make sure if you're doing something like this that can be so powerful but also so sensitive, that we make sure that kids know that this is a place where community matters in this classroom, where we are going to support each other, where when we hear somebody needs something, we try to respond in empathetic ways. And just as an aside also, I only do this lesson once I have established a firm and community in my classroom. If there is not like an intrinsic trust in that classroom, like I don't do this activity yet. This is not something I do on the first day of school. So really think about when you could do this. I will also say, I have heard from many people, many brave people who have tried, I wish my principal knew. I wish my superintendent knew. I wish my coach knew. And they have all told me that they have learned things that they never knew before. So that brings us to the end here. And I just wanted to quickly close with a story that I think wraps this all together. Last year, I had a student in my classroom who unfortunately had experienced a lot of grief, a lot of trauma, and was still working to process that. And every day, he would, instead of doing his work, he would like doodle. He would draw these really intricate pictures. And so I asked him about them. So like, what is this? Why are you drawing all these? And he said, it turns out that every night he had nightmares. He had nightmares every time he fell asleep. And when he came to school, he would draw them. And I mean, how emotionally intelligent that this kid is taking something that's, so tricky in his head, and he's putting it on paper where it is tangible, where he can control it. It's cathartic in a way that journaling is. And so he was doing this every day in class. And so once I learned that, we worked out a system where like he had some time to do that every day. And then he also had some time to get to his classwork. And so I was working towards the end of the year. We were doing all those assessments. And I called him over to my desk, and I was a little busy. So I was like, okay, just hold on a second. I got to finish this. And I said, just draw a picture. He said, what am I supposed to draw a picture of? I said, just draw a picture of me. So I finish up, I turn around, and he's drawn this like huge, elaborate picture again. And I said, what's the deal, man? I thought you were going to draw me. And he said, I did. He said, that's you and that's me, and we're holding hands. And that just really touched me, because I know for a fact, because of COVID, I never once held that kid's hand. I know I never did. But when he thought of his teacher, he thought of someone who held him, who connected with him, who supported him, who reached out. And that for me is my wish for you. My wish for all of you is that in your schools that you support, in your teachers that you support, in all those classrooms, that when kids think of their teacher, they think of someone who holds their hand. Well, thank you. That brings me to the end of my discussion today, and I'm very excited to do some Q&A with you all. So make sure you type it in the chat, and Susan is going to come on, and we are going to get to hear a little bit from you.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for that incredibly inspiring and powerful presentation. I know it has moved many of us, some of us to tears from what I can tell in the chat box. I'm sure that that's a reaction that you get often when you talk about your work. One of the things that strikes me, and I think many of our participants, is that whenever you've done this exercise of I wish my teacher knew, or when it's been modified for others, people were so ready to be heard. And I know that many educators are really feeling that way right now. And you started to hint a little bit at the ways that people are using this with their staff members. And we've got a whole bunch of professional learning leaders here, and many of them are already suggesting in the chat box, I want to use this from the district office with principals. I want to use it with principals listening to teachers. So what advice do you have about how to do this among adults?
Well, I think, one, I would say just try it. I would say it's probably less complicated than you think. I would definitely honor people's level of willingness to participate in it. It makes me think of, we had like a meeting and our principal, she wanted to check in with us and she said like, okay, 1 to 10, how's everyone doing today? And, like the first person said, I'm a 7, and the next one, I'm a 7. And it got to me and I'm like, I'm a -3. Like I had a terrible day. I had to sub, it was crazy. But since everyone else was like 7, I just went, I'm a 7, And so it is a little tricky to participate in that when you don't know how it's going to be received. So that's why I think it's so important to model with vulnerability. If my principal had said, I'm a 3, because I know her day and I know she was a 3, if she had done that, that would have allowed us to be a little bit more honest instead of participating in some of the required positivity that happens a lot in elementary school. So I would say to try it out, try to be vulnerable, and also just give it a go. I'm really curious what will happen. Reach out and connect with me if you guys do try it, because I really want to find out.
You heard it right here. Kyle's encouraging you to reach out and share your stories with her.
Yes.
One of the questions that came up about doing this with staff, which I think also applies with kids, is how you handle anonymity. Do you encourage people to use their names? Do you encourage people to be anonymous? Do you leave it open? How do you handle it?
Yeah, again, options, participate or not, this is not required, right? I do, with kids now, I kind of have like, okay, I put on the board, like you can say, talk to me about this. You can say, don't talk to me about this. You can write your name or not. I am really clear with like, guys, I'm an elementary school teacher and I know your handwriting. So and also there's kids all over. So you can not put your name, but I'm honest with the plausibility of that anonymity. I'm not even sure if like doing this with true anonymity would be the most helpful. But being honest with like, you can share this with me, but I might find out it's you. I think that might even be better. I have heard from people that have kind of like gone a little high tech, like they set up a whole Twitter account and gave their whole class the password. So they would all log in and then they really wouldn't know who said it. So that is an option, but I would even say like, just understanding, like leaving it open, like you can tell me, and it might be okay if I know who it is, and know that share with me what you're comfortable.
That's great advice. Thank you. One question we hear all the time is about making time. And that is true for all kinds of professional learning. And I think it also applies to learning from kids. So there are some questions about how do you create time for this? How do you balance this with academic standards and all the things you're expected to get done during the day?
It's not either or. luckily, right? It's not either or, it's both always at the same time. So like I said, that example of us reading that book and her really connecting with empathy. Well, it turns out a lot of the social emotional stuff that's getting really buzzy now, like those are actually also just reading comprehension skills because literature, I know it gets lost, but the purpose of literature is for us to understand ourselves in the world. So all that social emotional stuff helps us understand ourselves in the world. So it helps kids read, it helps kids be able to, achieve those academic standards. And again, like I have done so much, I've been really intentional about inviting kids to share, kind of the hardest parts of their life this year. So I shared a little bit about kids who wrote those letters, but I also did an activity where in the curriculum, they read this gorgeous book. It's called The Upside Down Boy. And we, instead of doing that little like curricular task, we wrote our own upside down stories. And so it was still academic, it's still like literacy, but they were able to share their own upside down stories. And I modeled it with sharing. When I was a kid, I saw my dad cry for the first time. And it just made me feel so upside down. And that is very different than like some of the experiences my kids have had. Like it doesn't have to be the same, but it's still coming from the same place. So I modeled it with that. It showed my own vulnerability, invited, not required, kids to do the same. And I got responses from, an unexpected move made them feel so upside down. The police coming and responding to domestic violence in their own home. I even had a kid who shared the story of finding his mother dead and burying her. And being able to write that and to use those skills of literacy to like tap into their own story, that is so powerful. That's why I'm saying we're just scratching the surface. And it wasn't like I didn't do any curriculum. I just adapted the curriculum in a way that was, I think, more powerful, not only social emotionally, but more powerful academically. When you're writing about those experiences, you're doing so in a way that real writers do. We write about things that we care about, and it helps you, care more about the craft of your writing. So all of this too, if you're interested in what I'm saying now, I'm super hyped about it. But that Elizabeth Dutro's book really has just opened my mind to all this. So I'd encourage you guys to check it out.
I know there are also some people who have mapped the Common Core standards onto social and emotional competencies, and that I think could be a good resource for people too, to understand and make the case for why this kind of exercise and this kind of work and relationship building actually is part of achieving academic standards. Yeah. So in some of the stories that you just mentioned, and also that you've been talking about this morning, there are some very serious incidences of trauma. And you gave us some really moving statistics on the number of children who are experiencing trauma. I know that you've gotten some questions in the past from educators about what to do when students come to you with such serious issues and concerns in their lives, particularly when teachers are not necessarily trained to be trauma specialists. How do you handle that? Who else do you get involved? And how do you ensure that students have all the needs met?
Well, I will share, I have not heard from something in this lesson in particular, personally, I have not heard of anything that I needed to take like further like serious action on. I have in other ways. So every single year I've had to make mandatory reports, which is kind of clear for us. It kind of makes it very clear, like, we know we are required to report something if it is brought to us, and we know the law on that. So that makes it really clear for us. I will also say that that is something that can be really intimidating for teachers. Like we think like, oh, I have no idea how to handle this. So maybe like practicing with teachers, maybe doing some like role playing with teachers would help them, or sharing your own experiences that would help them as well. But also like being clear, like you don't have to be like a certified counselor to support a kid in a hard time. Like just you being like a listening voice, someone who's witnessing them, who's paying attention, who hears them, who validates it. I mean, a kid who tells you something and they're just believed, that is so healing and so important. So I would say, you know, we've got to do something to help teachers with their intimidation around this, but also to encourage, like, you can just be a caring adult, and that is going to be enough.
Thank you for that reminder. And you also told that amazing story about the boy who had been telling himself that he is stupid until he got the note from his classmate. And so I just wanted to thank you for reminding all of us that even when it feels like we're doing the same thing over and over and it's not getting through and it's not working, that you really never know when that moment is going to come, that it does get through.
Yeah, I mean, trauma-informed work is not efficient. It is not. It is not easy. It's not efficient. It takes a lot longer. You're doing the same thing over and over again. It's worth it. But if your district or your schools are kind of thinking of like, oh, we want to be trauma informed because it'll like help kids' behavior and it'll help our test scores, like maybe it will, maybe. But also trauma is so individual that and grief and loss as well, and just stuff that doesn't even rise to the level of that, but just challenging every day. That is so individual that it might not like seem like it's working right away. You know, the measures that we use now are not trauma informed. So how can you find the impact of a trauma informed program when you're not using a trauma informed measure? So I would just say, caution you to, I wouldn't even sell it like trauma informed as something that's going to increase test scores or help behavior, because that's not what it's for. To think about like, we're going to do it because it's right for kids, and yeah, it'll also help them learn, which is cool too.
Let's talk a little bit about the pandemic. You
Yeah.
gave a few examples of connecting remotely with your students. And now we're in this kind of strange world where we're back in schools physically, most of us. That may change with the days. We never know. How are the conditions of the pandemic affecting the way that you do the I wish my teacher knew work with students? Does it require you to do things differently? Are you learning things differently? What does this look like today that maybe it didn't look like a few years ago?
You know, I think logistically, especially if you're in person, which we are now, I think most people are. I don't think logistically it impacts the lesson a lot, but I bet that kids will share with you a lot about what's going on in their lives and how the pandemic has affected them. Like I said, I don't think trauma-informed instruction and supporting kids this way is different than the curriculum. So in we were studying government. And so the curriculum was like, write a paragraph about government. But instead, I kind of shifted it a little bit, and we talked about the functions of government and what government does. And so we talked about everything from like schools to roads to like child welfare, healthcare, and employment. We talked about all that. And then I let kids choose which function of government they wanted to research and write about. And interestingly, of all their choices, every single kid chose one of two topics. They either chose child welfare, and many of them chose that because they had personal connections to it, or they chose healthcare. Of everything, those were the only two that they chose. And I had them write like why they chose those topics. And I remember one girl wrote like, oh, well, I want to study healthcare because when my mom got COVID, I was afraid she was going to die. So that's like on kids' minds all the time. And so I would expect that would be, that would come up in the notes as well. But also like think about if that's on their mind, how can we use school literacies to help them address it? How can all those things that are standard space, like research, composing a piece, organizing, how can we use those to help them understand their world better, to help them feel empowered because they get it more, that they can talk about it, they can help teach it to others? That's what I would say as well. But I would anticipate that just the pandemic in general would come up a lot more from your students and probably also from your teachers as well, if you're choosing to do it with them.
For our final question, I want to talk a little bit about the theme of belonging that you brought up. And you reminded us that you can't truly belong to a community unless you are a contributor to that community. And I think a lot of our educators would agree with that. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us from your own perspective and also what you've heard from others out there in the field about why belonging is important for educators and what education leaders can do to ensure that all of their staff and all of their colleagues have a sense of belonging at work.
Well, the first thing I would do would be to ask. Like, I would ask, you know, my teachers or my staff or the department I support, I would ask them, like, how they feel about belonging in this context. Do they feel like they belong, or do they feel like it's something we still need to work on? I would find a way to, like, elicit some information from them as well. I will also say the really tricky thing about helping people feel like they belong is allowing them to contribute, which means that we might have to give up some of our power and control. And that can be really tricky. So if you want your staff or your teachers to contribute, maybe they're going to make some decisions that wouldn't be exactly what you would do. And that can be hard. But I think a lot of times we try to do these belonging activities. I know I have done them where it's like, oh, here's the gingerbread contest, or like, you know, here everyone's going to get like a bag of chips because you're all that in a bag of chips. But if that's not accompanied with like, I care what you think, you have important ideas, and guess what? You actually have genuine decision-making ability, then it's fun, it's nice, it's not bad to get a bag of chips, but it's also not gonna help you tap into that power of true belonging that that it could be.
Thank you so much. That's a really great reminder to all of us.
Mhm.
And again, thank you for sharing these really inspiring stories and strategies. I know we have people who are already excited to connect with you. We'll be sure to make your contact information available.
Awesome. And if
And it
you
was a
guys,
great start.
I'll respond to everybody in the chat after this.
Perfect. So you can stay in the chat. The chat will be open for a few more minutes if you all want to stay in there. This is a great start to our day, and I am going to hand it off to my colleague, Fred Brown, who will send us into the next portion of the conference.
Okay, wow. So I hope you can see now why we were so excited for you to hear and see Kyle Schwartz. What an inspiration. Wow. And there's so much that we can take from what she said to us and what she shared today and the stories that were shared. I'm taking away the importance of belonging and how do we create those environments in our classrooms where belonging is the norm. The point about resources and barriers and thinking about all the gifts that our kids bring to our schools. Such words of inspiration, such powerful things for us to remember. So, Kyle Schwartz, thank you so much. Thank you for reminding us to listen to our students and do what's necessary to meet their needs. And I also want to thank Suzanne Bouffard. Suzanne, you were amazing in the Q&A sessions for all of our keynote speakers. So a special thank you and a virtual round of applause to Suzanne for just leading such great conversations. And so to all of our attendees, have a great day of learning, and we'll see you later this afternoon.